Welcome to the National Celiac Association's webinar on understanding and managing gluten-related conditions. My name is Carla Carter. I am the Director of Education and Programs with the National Celiac Association. I'm an occupational therapist. And joining us tonight is Christy Moran, registered dietitian, celiac expert, and NCA's nutritional advisory board member. We're very grateful to have you with us tonight, Christy. Thank you. All right, so we're going to get going. Please know that this information is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to substitute for personalized medical advice or to replace any medical advice provided to you by your healthcare team. And no liability is assumed by NCA or the presenters of the materials on these slides. All right, we're going to dig right in now. We are going to go over some foundational knowledge tonight about celiac disease, other gluten-related conditions, and then, of course, we will go over the gluten-free diet in depth. And then we will move on to the practical stuff about living every day and thriving with one of these conditions. And lastly, we will cover support and resources. So let's just talk about what celiac disease actually is. It is a genetic autoimmune disease where the immune system kind of makes a mistake and it abnormally reacts to gluten. So when someone with undiagnosed celiac disease eats gluten, what happens is the body says, oh no, this is a foreign invader, and it sends all of its spider cells to attack the lining of the small intestine where the villi are. And then it becomes damaged and inflamed, making it difficult to absorb nutrients properly, which can lead to deficiencies and other serious health complications. And here is a picture of the anatomy of celiac disease. In the middle are healthy villi. You can see they're nice and tall, and their job is actually to expand the surface area of your intestinal lining to better absorb nutrients. But in someone with celiac disease, those villi are blunted or atrophied, and they're much smaller. And there's often a lot of inflammatory cells going on there. So as you can see, it would be much more difficult to absorb nutrients. We're going to go much more in depth into what gluten is in a little while, but basically gluten is a protein. It's found in wheat, barley, and rye. It's one of the most common proteins in the human diet, and it kind of lends structure and elasticity to baked goods, which is sometimes why gluten-free food is often crumbly. Moving on to symptoms of celiac disease. There are over 200 possible symptoms or none at all, which makes it really hard to diagnose celiac disease. You have some what people think are typical symptoms of celiac disease are the gastrointestinal ones: diarrhea, constipation, abdominal pain, and bloating. Lactose intolerance is often found with celiac disease, because if you go back to the picture I showed you, those villi at the tip of them is the lactase enzyme to digest dairy. So you can imagine someone with celiac disease, those villi become, they're blunted, the enzyme kind of goes away for some people. As the villi grow back, sometimes the enzyme comes back as well. So just a little bit of background about that. Non-gastrointestinal symptoms are very common: fatigue, depression, neuropathy, which is numbness and tingling in the hands and feet, dental abnormalities such as dental enamel defects, and the list goes on. And lastly, malabsorptive related symptoms such as anemia, iron deficiency, vitamin deficiencies. Also, osteopenia and osteoporosis are secondary conditions from celiac disease. So it's really important to think about bone health with celiac disease. There are some associated conditions as well. You can see this list here. People are more at risk for other autoimmune diseases. Type 1 diabetes, there's a higher association with celiac disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, moving on down to lupus and vitiligo. A lot of people do get concerned about the risk of cancer. And while untreated and undiagnosed individuals with celiac disease are at a slightly higher risk of cancer, once you start the gluten-free diet, that risk definitely decreases and normalizes to that of the general population within about 5 years. So it's a really important thing that once diagnosed, you stick to that gluten-free diet. Okay, so moving on to diagnosis. How do you get diagnosed? Well, hopefully you're talking with your doctor in the doctor's office and they're doing a complete medical history, a physical exam, you're sharing your symptoms, and then you get some blood work done or serological testing. And they're going to test for antibodies associated with celiac disease. The first and most popular one is TTG-IgA, tissue transglutaminase antibody. And that is actually part of a total IgA, which is the next one. So you really want to do a celiac panel or have it done rather to get both of those done combined. What can happen is some people are deficient in their total IgA count, which means that their TTG numbers may be slightly skewed. So you want to get a full count of that total IgA. If you are someone who is deficient, the DGP can also be ordered. And then lastly, the EMA or endomysial antibody is one that isn't really used so much anymore, but can be really helpful for confusing results. And then next is an endoscopy. And the endoscopy is still considered the gold standard for diagnosing celiac disease in the United States. And what happens is an endoscope is a small tube with a camera on the end of it, and it is passed down in through your mouth and throat and down to the stomach, all the way to the small intestine. And at the very beginning is called the duodenum and the duodenal bulb. It's really important that they take a look at that and all of your small intestine and take what's called a biopsy, which is a small sample of the lining of the small intestine. They'll need to take multiple samples to send those off to the lab. And just one really important note, it is so critical that you do not start the gluten-free diet before going through this diagnostic process. You really do need the antibody levels to be accurate as well as the biopsy results, because as soon as you go through that start the gluten-free diet, you start healing. So it can lead to inconclusive or potentially false results. Okay, so the treatment. The only treatment approved for celiac disease is the gluten-free diet. So that means all food that contains gluten or might have had contact with gluten, which is known as cross contact, must be avoided. There are a number of treatments beyond the gluten-free diet that are currently in development, but none have advanced far enough to be considered viable. You can visit clinicaltrials.gov for more information on, I think there are 30 or more studies currently, but in general, that list is ongoing there. So some other gluten-related conditions, dermatitis herpetiformis is actually a form of celiac disease. And this is an itchy, blistering skin rash. And in almost all cases, the small intestine of a person with DH is also damaged by ingesting gluten. So DH is diagnosed by a skin biopsy by a dermatologist, but the GI really should also look down into the lining of your small intestine to check on a baseline health of your small intestine. And the treatment for DH is a strict gluten-free diet that may also include medications to help manage those symptoms. All right, moving on to non-celiac gluten and wheat sensitivity. So this condition affects up to 6% of the population, and the symptoms are very similar or can be to those with celiac disease. However, unlike celiac disease, there is usually minimal to no damage to the intestinal villi. There is no test or biological marker to test for NCGS or NCWS. And really a diagnosis can only be made after celiac disease and wheat allergy have been ruled out. And eliminating gluten from the diet is the only treatment for this condition as well. And lastly, wheat allergy. So the allergic immune reaction is actually a separate immune reaction from an autoimmune disease like celiac disease. It's a separate part of the immune system rather. So what happens as with most allergies, you can be allergic to anything, but with wheat ingestion, people get reactions in their skin, mouth, lungs, or GI system. It's usually diagnosed by an allergist, and a wheat-free diet is the treatment, and it may include medications to manage symptoms. Please know that when we're talking about celiac disease, we did talk about some numbers with the other conditions, but you are definitely not alone. Celiac disease affects about 3 million people in the US, and over 80% of those people are undiagnosed, walking around not feeling great in most cases. So that's about 1% of the population. And first-degree relatives are affected. 1 in 14 is the statistic, and for second-degree relatives, 1 in 43. So should family members get screened? Absolutely. Those higher risk individuals, such as first-degree family members, should be screened on a regular basis. The recommendation does vary between 2 to 4 years, unless somebody is symptomatic, and then they recommend immediately. And again, first-degree relatives are your parent's child sibling. Second-degree relatives are those cousins, aunts, uncles. And they would probably do that antibody blood test for that celiac panel to do that screening. And lastly, you can get gene tested for HLA-DQ2 or HLA-DQ8. Those are the celiac-associated genes. However, please note that this can only rule out celiac disease. It cannot be used as a diagnostic test. About a third of the population is walking around with one or both of those genes, but a very small subset goes on to develop the disease. So it's less than 5% of that grouping that will develop the disease. So again, genetic testing can be an important part of the picture, but it cannot be used as a diagnostic tool. So ongoing care and follow-up. This slide and the next are really important. A lot of people we hear are not really given a lot of instruction about follow-up care. And while there's not one standard approach, and each person's case and condition might vary from these recommendations, but in general, at diagnosis, you want to have visits, hopefully with a knowledgeable gastroenterologist and registered dietitian who know about celiac disease. You really want to get a baseline level of blood work that includes a complete blood count, checking on also your vitamins and minerals as a baseline. You want to make sure you have your thyroid checked. Bone density scans are recommended for adults to check on that bone health, really, really important, and on a case-by-case basis for children regarding the bone density scan. At 3 months, children may need an appointment to be monitored for growth and or see an RD or GI specialist, also for adults, depending on the case. At 6 months, again, visits with GI and RD. They might do some more blood work to check on those antibodies to see if you're headed in the right direction with them decreasing, and then monitoring for micronutrient deficiencies again, and children are monitored for growth here. And again, at 12 months, I think pretty much every appointment with the physician, kids are monitored for growth. And the annual appointment, yes, you made it a year. You want to see GI and RD again in most cases. It is not standardized to have a repeat endoscopy, but some clinicians would like to do that, especially if you are still symptomatic. They might have a discussion about that with you. Definitely more blood work to see how you're doing on your vitamins, minerals, thyroid, etc. And those who don't have any complications may have annual follow-ups going forward. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Christy.
All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'm just going to pull up my slides here. So again, just a reminder that it takes time for healing to be complete. Very often healing can begin fairly quickly. Some people can feel better within days, some people weeks, some people months, and it's not unheard of for people to still not feel perfect for the first year. Sometimes it can take even 1-2 years for the villi to grow back completely and for everything to heal. So that's an important reminder. Don't be too concerned if you still feel a little bit unwell, but that's where continued follow-up with your physician and GI and dietitian are so important. There may also be secondary conditions that can cause delay in healing. So, again, that's where follow up is really important. So, just a little bit about non responsive celiac disease. I want to make sure people understand this is different than refractory celiac disease, which is actually very rare. Refractory celiac disease is when someone goes on a gluten free diet. They are very good with the diet. There's no other causes of potential symptoms or um, gut damage, and they find that that could potentially be refractory, meaning they don't respond to a gluten-free diet. And sometimes that may require medications, but again, that's very rare. But we do often see this non-responsive celiac disease. Anywhere from 7 to 30% of patients don't improve on a gluten-free diet. And the number one reason is that people have dietary indiscretion, they have inadvertent gluten exposure. Um, and so it is really important. That's where meeting with a dietitian is so important, to go over all the ins and outs of the diet and just make sure that they're not missing anything. It can be reacting to oats. It can be reacting to other carbohydrate components of foods or other carbohydrate intolerances, as Carla had mentioned about lactose intolerance and the lactase enzyme on the tip of the villi. We're seeing fructose malabsorption a little bit more often. And with those things, you may have heard of this diet called the FODMAP diet. And that diet is sometimes recommended for the right patient. It is incredibly important to do it under the advice of a registered dietitian with expertise, because the diet is incredibly complicated, especially on top of a fully gluten free diet. And it is supposed to be followed in stages, not a long term diet. Potentially, someone could have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, also called SIBO, other food allergies or intolerances, pancreatic enzyme deficiencies, microscopic colitis, and then again, rarely refractory celiac. So let's get into the nitty gritty, the fun, important part, and the only treatment for celiac disease, which is the gluten free diet. So this is a list of those gluten-containing grains that we want to be avoiding. Wheat, barley, rye, and then there's many different types of wheat specifically. So durum, einkorn, spelt, kamut. What I want to make sure people understand is that sometimes we may hear that some of these grains are lower in gluten, or that some people will say they are gluten-free, but we want to make clear they are not gluten-free and they are not appropriate for someone that has celiac disease. Someone with a non-celiac gluten sensitivity potentially could tolerate some of these, and mostly the reason for that is because oftentimes non-celiac gluten sensitivity is actually a intolerance to the carbohydrate component of gluten or wheat called fructan, and some of these other types of wheat are a little bit lower in that fructan component. And we'll come back to that in a little bit too. So some specifics about barley malt, because malt is always going to be from barley and should be avoided. And this is one of, I think, the most confusing and missed ingredients that people maybe don't look at. So we might see this on the food label as one of the ingredients that are listed here. So malt, malt extract, malt vinegar, malt syrup, flavoring, brewer's yeast, and then these three ingredients on the bottom: yeast extract, autolyzed yeast extract, brown rice syrup, and smoke flavoring, may all be derived from barley. And because barley does not have to be listed on the label very clearly, these potentially could be derived from barley. So it's important to look into those ingredients. When we think about yeast extract, one example is something that's called Marmite, which is a British food spread, and many people have heard of that. And that has been tested, and it is higher in gluten than is appropriate for someone with celiac disease. So that's a good example of that yeast extract. So other potential sources of gluten other than our just gluten grains might be processed foods, whether they have gluten ingredients added or whether they are manufactured, processed, grown along with foods that contain gluten and therefore may have been cross-contacted. Medications, vitamins, and supplements all need to be checked. Seasonings and spice mixes, sometimes there can be gluten containing ingredients added to those, so it's important to look at that. Soy sauce very often has wheat added to the process, but there are many versions that are gluten free. And then other sauces as well, always one to be double checking the ingredients there. We talked a little bit about that smoke flavoring, maybe being derived from barley. And then soup and soup bases. Sometimes there can be gluten added as a thickener. Sometimes there can be flavorings, seasonings added that are going to be derived from gluten. And then some imitation seafood and imitation bacon, although there are versions now of imitation seafood that are gluten free. And then French fries and fried foods. So if these are cooked in the same fryer that is cooking foods that contain gluten, there is that cross contact risk. So if there's any fried items that are at a restaurant or on a menu, we want to be making sure to ask if it is a dedicated gluten free fryer. So, what I also think is one of the more important things is to talk about what is gluten free, because really, when we compare the list of what is not gluten free to the list of things that are gluten free, there are so many more things that are gluten free, luckily. And one of the easiest ways to think about a gluten free diet is really thinking about those naturally gluten free foods. It's going to take a little bit less time when it comes to reading all the labels of highly processed foods that have tons of ingredients. And then we know that many of these, again, are naturally gluten free. So, fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, eggs, poultry, milk and cheese, rice, potatoes. We're going to talk about some of the other gluten free grains, beans and legumes, nuts and seeds. And so, if any of these ingredients or items are processed, then we do want to be thinking about what's added to them. How are they processed? Is there a risk there that they may come in contact with gluten? Um, One really important thing when it comes to the gluten free grains, nuts, and seeds, we do recommend that people buy products that are labeled gluten free for those because of the higher potential risk of cross contact. And then with um, especially lentils, beans, legumes, peas that are dried, it is important to rinse them, pick through them to make sure there are not any little grains in them because there is that potential risk. But picking them out, rinsing them well has been shown to be safe. So, again, some of the gluten free grains and flours and starches. And again, if we compare this to our list of ones that contain gluten, we've got our wheat, rye, barley, and then gluten-free ones, look at how many more we have here. So we've got rice, we've got corn, we've got potato, even sweet potato, quinoa, millet, amaranth, arrowroot, buckwheat, which is technically a pseudo grain, chestnut flour, lentil flour, chickpea flour, sorghum, soy, tapioca, teff. And the ones that are listed and highlighted in blue are a little bit higher in nutrients, potentially a little bit higher in fiber. So these, we really encourage people to incorporate these in your diet. And many of these may be very new to some people. They might be ones that you've never been exposed to. But I really encourage people to branch out and try these things, not only because they are more nutritious, but it gives a lot of variety, and it makes things interesting. And I always like to think about the gluten-free diet as an opportunity to expand the variety of foods that you have been exposed to. So I think very often we think of a gluten-free diet as very restrictive, but when we look at it in a way that we're thinking about, okay, what are all the gluten-free things that we can have? And very often I find a lot of people, after they've gone gluten-free, they're like, I learned about this fruit or vegetable, I learned about this grain, and they're including a lot more variety than they had before. So important to focus on the positives there. One other thing to mention with these, sometimes the grains that are higher fiber may cause a little bit of GI upset or distress for some people if they weren't used to eating a lot of a lot of high fiber foods, or if they had been eating less fiber and they're including more fiber. So go slow. Introduce those slowly, and usually over time, people develop better tolerance to that. So, what about oats? We had a lot of questions about this, and this is something that comes up really often. We want to be careful. So, oats themselves are gluten free naturally, but commercially available oats in the US have had cross contact with gluten containing grains through either crop rotation, harvesting, processing, transportation. So, for people with celiac disease and severe gluten sensitivity, we really recommend people use gluten free oats. They are considered safe for people, most people with celiac disease. There's a very small subset of those with celiac that also react to adenine, which is the protein that is in oats. So there is potential that people may not tolerate these well. There are many ways that oats can be kept gluten free. And what's really important is to know what some of these processes are. So, the term purity protocol oats, many of you may have heard this. Basically, what that is they are oats that are grown, manufactured, processed, harvested, all strictly gluten free with no potential cross contact with other grains, so that they are purely gluten free because there has been no contact. Then we have gluten free oats that have either been mechanically or optically sorted. We want to make sure if we're getting oats that are made gluten-free this way, that we're making sure that the company has very rigorous, transparent testing, and consistently they're testing below 20 parts per million. So optical sorting is using technology to remove gluten-containing grains from oats, looking at them on a line, and there is always a little possibility that this is not foolproof and that there may be fragments or dust left behind. So, again, we want to make sure that the companies that are using this technology are really transparent about their testing and they are consistently testing. Um, all right. And so, again, testing process to determine possible contact with gluten is the key to choosing gluten free oats, regardless of the type of protocol used. And there is lots more information about this. If you want to learn more, we've got a link down there. When it comes to alcohol for those over 21, gluten-free options are wines, gluten-free ciders, distilled spirits. So distilled spirits are going to be gluten-free because the distillation process renders them gluten-free because the gluten protein is not large enough to make it over into the product. With those products, though, we do want to be careful of any that may have things added after the distillation process, because then it may not be gluten free. And then gluten free beers um, are going to be okay as well. So avoiding those gluten reduced or removed beers because those are not going to be safe for celiac. And then the alcohol that contains gluten is going to be most beer. There's always going to be malted barley used, ales, lagers, malt beverages, which sometimes that one can be tricky because they are not always very clearly labeled as containing gluten because sometimes people are not thinking about malt. So I always encourage my patients to look for that label on any alcoholic beverages. That word, I mean the malt word. So there's a lot of new spiked seltzers and drinks like that out in cans, and some of them are actually malt beverages and then would not be gluten free. So keeping an eye on that. And then looking at the ingredients and reading the label for any mixers, spiked seltzers, wine coolers, hard lemonade. Again, some of the wine coolers, hard lemonades, and even some of the seltzers may contain gluten containing ingredients. So, some of the challenges with the gluten free diet are that many of the processed gluten free foods can be low in fiber, can be higher in fat. They may have more sugar added, more high fructose corn syrup. And sometimes this is because manufacturers want to make a product that has a good taste and a good mouthfeel. And sometimes those things are adjusted in the products to make them taste better. But we do just have to be aware of this and look for those products that either are not as high in added sugars, added fats. Obviously, these things are okay on occasions and they are not something we have to be avoiding, but just to be aware that that is one potential challenge. And there are many products that are processed that are gluten free that are still high in fiber, that are high nutrient. So there are options available. We just have to sometimes do a little more digging or go to a specific store to find those certain brands. Um, Sometimes the diet can be low in certain vitamins and minerals if we are not being intentional about some of the things that we're choosing. So, B vitamins, iron, calcium, zinc, and magnesium. And many food products are not fortified or enriched with some of these things as well. So, that's also where we can have a little bit lower intake. There's many natural foods that contain these. And if somebody either is on another limited or restricted diet for other reasons, then sometimes there might be these deficiencies that may need to be supplemented. So that's why it is important to monitor these, also meet with a dietitian on a fairly regular basis to make sure that these things are being assessed. Okay. And then always, as a dietitian, of course, I'm thinking about focusing on nutrition. And as I mentioned before, it's kind of an opportunity for us to eat a variety of different foods. One of the best things for overall gut health is having a variety of different foods, especially a variety of plant foods. And that includes all of our naturally gluten free stuff, all of our gluten free grains, our tubers, our fruits, our herbs and spices, nuts and seeds, and things like that. So, focusing on those is really going to also give you more nutrient dense foods, and therefore, we often don't have to be as concerned about some of these nutrient deficiencies. And choosing the more nutritious gluten free grains when you can. Very often, there's many products that have maybe rice and other gluten free whole grains, and so those are good options. And then when choosing processed foods, choose enriched or fortified products that are gluten free, grain based. So, like breads, cereals, rice, that kind of thing. And there are, even though there are not as many choices as when you are not on a gluten free diet, there are options available. So again, these are some of those really nutritious grains and seeds. And you see here, you've got some of the specific ones that have those higher nutrients in them. So amaranth is a higher protein, fiber, calcium, and iron. Quinoa, same thing, also has some of the B vitamins. Chia seeds, flax seeds are great sources of fiber and omega 3s. We've got buckwheat that's naturally high in our proteins, some of our B vitamins, fiber, niacin, thiamine, which is another B vitamin, zinc. And then teff is one of my favorites. I think it's underutilized. It does have a very like nutty flavor. And so very often it is used along with something like a rice flour or potato starch or something like that to give it a better mouthfeel. But there's lots of different ways to use all those different grains. And again, with our grains, we do want to be looking for ones that are labeled gluten-free. So, speaking of labeling, we're going to talk a little bit of the details about how to decide what is safe based on food labels. So, we can't talk about food labeling without talking about the FDA, so the Food and Drug Administration. They consider a food to be gluten free when it contains less than 20 parts per million, including from cross contact. So, parts per million is a term that is a measurement referred to in food manufacturing to describe the amount of gluten in a product. It is not a specific amount itself. It's more of a how we talk about how much gluten might be in a food, but it's not a specific milligram amount. It's more the concentration. And then for a product to be labeled gluten free, we are going to look at that at the next slide, but we want to check anything that we're ingesting: foods, beverages, gums, mints, candies, supplements, medications, all that stuff. Think about if we are going to be consuming it, swallowing it, we want to be thinking, is it gluten free? So when we think about gluten free, it often comes up the question of what does that mean? Like, how much is too much? How much is gonna potentially cause damage? And there is definitely a range in sensitivity for individuals, but studies show most individuals with celiac disease can tolerate up to 10 milligrams of gluten per day. When we look at the little picture on the right here, this is a depiction of what 10 milligrams of gluten in the form of bread would look like in one bite. So keep in mind, this amount is the amount that is tolerated for most individuals throughout the day. So if we like broke this up into little pieces, they're little crumbs. Um, Note that this depiction is just what it looks like for 10 milligrams of gluten in bread. Because when we think about this in terms of bread, flour, or all purpose flour, it's going to be different. Flour is about 13%, 10 to 13% gluten. If we've got a cup of that flour, that's about 120 grams or 12,000 milligrams of gluten. So when it comes to the flours, it can be just a tiny pinpoint. So I wanted to make sure that that was clear, that when it's in bread, keeping in mind that bread in and of itself is not 100% gluten. So it's going to look a little bit bigger than what the amount of gluten in flour is going to look like. Some individuals will have villus atrophy with less than 10 milligrams per day. And we really can't tell who that individual is going to be. It's a little bit of trial and error, see how things go. And that is where sometimes if we have a patient that is still not healing, we may be a little bit more cautious about potential cross contact with gluten and see if that helps. So allergens on the food label are monitored by the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. So this labeling law requires that products list major allergens. It does not include guidelines regarding cross contact with the foods, but they have to list the top allergens. Wheat is included in one of those. As you see, barley and rye are not included in those. So those are ones we still have to decipher from the ingredients. So wheat will be declared in one of two ways. It'll either be in the contained statement um, or following the ingredient list. So it'll say contains wheat, or it might be in parentheses following an ingredient that contains that allergen. So wheat, modified food starch, in parentheses wheat, you might see it listed that way. Again, barley and rye are not listed as major allergens. And one very important thing is wheat-free does not necessarily mean gluten-free, because barley and rye might not be included with that. So gluten-free labeling is voluntary. And I think this, again, is really important. And this is where some of the confusion comes in. Manufacturers are not required to indicate gluten-free status on their label, but they can. If they do, they have to follow certain guidelines. So if they're going to be using that gluten-free label, the foods um, that are naturally gluten-free, foods that do not contain more than 20 parts per million of gluten, and they don't contain any unavoidable gluten in the food due to cross contact or migration of gluten from packing materials, and the foods that contain gluten grains that have been gluten removed, wheat starch, glucose syrup, distilled vinegar, citric acid. So those, if the product contains those ingredients, but the then final end product is less than 20 parts per million, that it is allowed to be labeled gluten-free. So when we are looking at a label, we want to follow steps to really determine if a product is gluten-free. See if the product states that it's gluten-free first. This may or may not be listed. And then look at the allergen statements and ingredient listing. Wheat must be declared if it's present. This rule does not always apply to meat, poultry, and eggs because they are regulated by a different um, system. And then looking at ingredients carefully, again, particularly whether wheat, rye, barley, malt, those other three, yeast extract, brown rice syrup, smoke flavoring, if those are included, oat ingredients are listed. And then if you are ever unsure about the gluten-free status of a product, it's important to contact the manufacturer to verify that gluten-free status. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a slide or two. This advisory statement, processed in a facility or on shared equipment that also processes wheat. Again, this is voluntary. So it's really important to remember manufacturers may or may not take the necessary steps to prevent cross contact. And they also don't have to put this on there. They may put it on there. Just because a product has this advisory statement doesn't necessarily mean it is not gluten free. It just means we want to look into it a little bit more. But if a food is labeled gluten-free, again, remember it has to be less than 20 parts per million of gluten. That includes cross contact. So if something's labeled gluten-free and has this allergen statement, it is most likely going to be safe. But if it is not labeled gluten-free, then we do have to look into it a little bit more and determine whether we feel it is safe for the individual. So we can contact the manufacturer to ask more questions about the process. So, is gluten used on the same lines or on the same equipment? What are the cleaning protocols between batches? Do they test for gluten? And very often, when we get the answers to those questions, we can tell whether we feel comfortable enough to consume the product or whether we think it's too high risk. And then we've got our gluten-free certification, which is kind of one extra step above things being labeled gluten-free. So these are different than the gluten-free labeling. It is done by third-party organizations. There are many different organizations and certifications available, and they do all vary a little bit in the requirements, but all must adhere to the minimum FDA standard of 20 parts per million. Some of them have lower standards, and many of them have more rigorous monitoring than just the gluten-free label. So if it is certified gluten-free, it's kind of that one extra step. And then sometimes we'll see these terms gluten friendly, gluten smart, gluten conscious. These are not legal terms and they truly don't have any specific meaning to them. They can technically be, um, someone can have a different definition for them. So these terms are sometimes used in restaurants, or food providers will sometimes indicate that a dish is like this or is made without gluten-containing ingredients, the interpretation can vary widely, and while some dishes may be safe for people with celiac disease, there is no guarantee. And so we do have to ask more questions about those. So again, gluten-free is the only food label that has a legal definition. When we are researching different products, there's many ways to do it now. I was chatting with Carla earlier today and letting her know I've had celiac since I was 3 years old. And it used to be that we called manufacturers all the time. A lot of this information can be available now on websites in their frequently asked questions. But products do still have a contact number, usually on the label or on their website. You can ask to speak with a manager, and then you can ask all those questions that we talked about earlier. Oops. You can also email or contact the manufacturer through their website sometimes. And when in doubt, or if you've asked those questions and you're still feeling uncertain, it's always best to choose an alternative if you're feeling uncertain about it. Okay. So medications are also a little bit different when it comes to labeling. They sometimes use a binder or filler in medications, although this is rare according to the FDA. You should always check the ingredients of medications over the counter or prescription. Note that the rules of labeling medications are different than food. Fillers can be derived from wheat, but don't have to be declared. The FDA's issued draft guidance for how gluten should be labeled on medications. However, it's not required, but you may see the statement contains no ingredient made from gluten-containing grain. Some legislative efforts are in the process to call out gluten and other allergens in medications and even on food labels, and hopefully that will improve over time, fingers crossed. These are just some tips on ways that you can research medications. You can form your physician. Honestly, the pharmacist tends to be a great resource. You can ask questions. You can ask if there needs to be. You can write no substitutions on the prescription if it needs to be a specific manufacturer. You can check the pharmaceutical inserts, contact the pharmacy, the pharmaceutical company themselves. Those numbers are usually listed easily. And then you can search some different databases like Daily Med. And if unable to get a gluten-free medication, there's always the option of using a compounding pharmacy. Skincare products. So in terms of skincare products, they are not required when someone has celiac disease. They are optional. The gluten protein is too big to penetrate the intact skin, keeping in mind that if there are major cuts or breaks in the skin, there is potential that they could get through in that way. But with skin intact, that is not a risk. Recommended to be gluten-free if there is potential that being ingested, though. So oftentimes for some younger children, we think about that when it comes to shampoos and soaps, when they might be swallowing some bathwater. We think about that with like lotions, possible exposure if they're near the mouth or on your hands, lipsticks, lip balms. Studies show little risk, however, we want to be using some caution there. All right, and I'm going to now turn it back over to Carla.
We are going to get moving on to everyday living and thriving. I really want to point that big word out because it is possible for sure to thrive healthfully with celiac disease or another condition. First and foremost is the sticker shock. So let's talk about everyday living and being able to afford the gluten-free diet because we all know it can be expensive. So you really want to take the time to understand the diet, and everything that Christy just talked about will help you to learn to manage the diet in a more affordable way, and you can learn how to maximize your budget. We have a budget guide just for this because we know it's such an issue for all of us, whether you're facing food insecurity or otherwise. We could all afford, we could all benefit from this. So in the budget guide on the website here, it lists comprehensive tips and tricks for long-term success, many of which I've tried myself. I didn't mention I've had celiac disease a very long time as well, and they are tried and true tips. So All right, I just want to go back to cross contact to talk about that a little bit. And cross contact is really when there's contact between a gluten containing food onto a gluten-free food. Sometimes you'll hear cross contamination, and that's fine too. That cross contamination refers to bacteria transfer. So we just use the term cross contact. And when you're thinking about it in your kitchen every day, here are some just common examples where cross contact can occur on lots of surfaces like tables and counters, crumbs in toasters, on cooking utensils that are shared between foods, pots, pans, cutting boards, and knives that aren't cleaned properly. Some people say or think or worry they've had, have to throw out all their pans. And if everything is intact, cleaning does the job. You want to think about spreads and condiments that are shared that might contain crumbs. And then baking. You want to use caution in the kitchen when baking with regular flour at the same time as preparing gluten-free foods because flour kind of gets in the air. And we also recommend using caution when dining at non-dedicated bakeries or pizzerias. Definitely in those more commercial settings, there's a lot more flour in the air, and it can take upwards of 24 or more hours for flour to settle. So you want to make sure anywhere that you're eating out, you're asking a lot of questions, and they have very rigorous cleaning methods. All right, so moving on to sharing a kitchen. It's totally possible to have a shared kitchen with gluten. You just need to take some precautions. And just again, as I mentioned, this washing items works. So using soap and water or in the dishwasher, it can remove gluten from these easy to clean and undamaged items. Washing counters works, pots and pans, all those items that are listed there. Towels and aprons are kind of another place. You just want to make sure those get thrown in the washing machine. We do recommend dedicated items that are more difficult to clean with this list here. A toaster for sure, because there are a lot of crumbs in there. Strainers, cast iron pans kind of hold food. Fry laters, waffle irons, sandwich makers, you can read there. Anything also with a convection setting is a risk for blowing kind of gluten around if you have shared it. So yeah, don't use the same utensils between foods without washing thoroughly. So if you're cooking 2 pots of pasta, you want to use 2 different spoons. And then definitely no double dipping in the condiments. There, are a lot of crumbs usually when that happens. Some helpful tips. These are just a couple, and just to let you guys know, we have a more comprehensive list for pretty much everything we're talking about tonight on our website. It's a free download called The Complete Guide to Gluten-Free Living. We will share that link with you, don't worry. But there are some more tips related to sharing a kitchen. But we do recommend storing gluten-free products separately and above gluten-containing products. It's really helpful to label or color code gluten-free items. You can try to have fun with it. And sometimes in our house, if there's a gluten butter, my other daughter without celiac disease will put a skull and crossbones on it. So we try to have a little fun while we can. All right, so moving on to holidays and celebrations. You can still enjoy a lot of traditions, and it just takes a little bit of planning, and communication is really key. So you want to communicate with whomever is hosting about what's being served. Let them know about your need to be on a gluten-free diet. Ask about ingredients and prep methods. If you're comfortable doing this, of course. Not everybody's comfortable doing that. So you've got to find your best way to advocate for yourself or your family member, loved one. Also you could offer to help. Potlucks are great because you can definitely bring something that you can eat. Just want to make sure you grab some of it and as much as you want before it gets into a buffet, because there can be some double dipping once other people kind of grab some. And you can always offer to be the host. That can be fun as well. All right, here's the big one, dining out. A lot of you asked about dining out. There is so much fun that can be had dining out still. And again, it does take that extra bit of research. You can look restaurants up and their menus online. We have our own restaurant search feature, but there are other applications out there and websites that have searches. You can get recommendations from friends, family, or people you know who also need gluten-free food. And just to let you know, you want to call the restaurant ahead of time if you're not sure, and ask about gluten-free menu options and their procedures for gluten-free food. Off hours are the best. I find around 4 p.m. in the afternoon if you're going out to dinner or whatnot, because they're not going to have time to talk with you on really during busy hours. Some things to ask when you call. First and foremost, do they have a gluten-free menu? A lot of places do these days, but not all gluten-free menus are created equal if you have celiac disease versus another gluten-related condition. If you have celiac disease, you really do need to take the extra steps to make sure that they are keeping you safe with cross contact. Do they keep their gluten-free items separate? Do they have separate preparation areas? Do they use separate utensils, separate fryolators? So again, you want to make sure they're kind of eliminating cross contact for you. Can they clean the grill, or would they be willing to use aluminum foil when they're toasting? Another area sometimes is they use pasta water to steam or bathe vegetables. So just some things to think about. And again, there is more of a comprehensive list of things to think about or ask in our guide. At the restaurant, you just want to tell the manager and the staff about your requirements. And we do have a gluten-free dining card that helps to explain this. It's printable, and this is the front of it. It explains a little bit about the disease and what you have to avoid. And on the back, some common places to look out for. Travel, travel, travel. Do not hesitate to travel. Don't be afraid to get out there and live your life, okay? It does take a little bit of research and planning and preparation. You want to research restaurants and stores ahead of time. Always carry gluten-free snacks with you. Some people have food shipped ahead of time, and they'll rent an Airbnb so they can make their own food. It's frequently common. We do this all the time to book a room with a refrigerator or a kitchenette. If you're traveling internationally, a lot of airlines will offer a gluten-free meal when flying. You just want to make sure when you're checking in that they have that listed for you and that it truly is on the flight. But in case it's not, you're going to have your gluten-free snacks with you, and you'll be okay, and you'll get lots of food when you get there. And then sometimes choosing locations that have naturally gluten-free cuisines takes a lot of the worry and stress away. You still need to do some work when you get there and whenever you're eating out, but it makes it a lot easier. There are some unique situations that different age groups face. With kids, teens, and young adults, definitely there are unique situations with peers, school systems, and a lot more. Celiac disease is considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act for several reasons, actually. And so families should be aware that in the school system, there are things called 504 plans that you can set up with your school to provide basic accommodations for your child. And this ranges from accommodations such as having unrestricted access to the bathroom, or being notified when there is going to be flour in the curriculum for a project, but it also sets the stage for your child when they're in college. We have a really comprehensive landing page here, Raising Our Celiac Kids, that has a lot more information about being a kid and a teen with celiac disease. All right, I'm going to move on to support and resources. You guys have been great for staying with us. We are almost done, and we're going to get to some questions. But first, please know that support can make a difference, okay? There's a lot of positives to think about, but we also want to validate that there are psychological challenges to having a diagnosis of celiac disease or another gluten-related condition. There is some anxiety, there is depression, isolation and fear of getting sick, and some embarrassment. There's a very high perceived burden because of the gluten-free diet. And so we really want to validate those, but also make sure that there are strategies. Christy talked about the importance of being vigilant and being careful. And I want to just to cover also vigilance, between the difference between that and hypervigilance. So we've talked a lot about, again, checking labels, thinking about cross contact and asking the questions that we need to do. But we just have to be careful that it doesn't impact our quality of life, that we're not isolating ourselves at home, that we're not so fearful of eating that we limit what we're eating and restrict things so much. One study did show that those who are hyper vigilant on the gluten-free diet actually have a lower quality of life. So it's really, really important that we validate the psychological challenges, that we are vigilant to keep ourselves healthy, but that it doesn't cross over to being kind of this thing that creates a dysfunction in our lives. So there is a lot of power and positivity, and I really hope that we are trying to help you with that tonight if you are struggling. Really think about stress management. It's really an important part of the journey. And you want to think about positive ways that you can impact your life to keep that positive mindset, to make it easier to cope. Think about those positive coping strategies that might help you. And I know that this first line here, we are lucky to have a diagnosis. Some of you might have a hard time with that. But if you think about that statistic back at the beginning of the presentation, that over 80% of people are undiagnosed and feeling really terrible. You know, we are lucky to have an answer. Me personally, I was so happy to get diagnosed because I was so tired of being sick. And so also we become experts at reading labels. We figure out what we're putting into our bodies. We do a lot of cooking and baking together, and we get to eat those diverse foods that Chrissy was talking about. And a lot of my friends let me pick the restaurant. So that's super fun. So see what we can do to turn those challenges into opportunities for as many situations as you can. Moving on to what NCA does. Well, we literally exist to help you get through every day. We have a very comprehensive website that has a lot of these search features: finding a doctor, those Ask the Expert FAQs. We have Ask the Expert webinars with colleagues from around the nation and some from around the world. We have our monthly free e-newsletter with a lot of great updates scientifically, and then recipes. I've mentioned the Complete Guide to Gluten-Free Living, Thrifty Gluten-Free Cookbook, both free downloads, but both available for purchase as well in a print copy. And then Gluten-Free Nation magazine that comes 3 times a year to members. We do have a monthly national online support group. It's the second Tuesday of every month from at 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. And I have to say, this is a fabulous group of people, incredibly supportive of each other. And we talk a lot about how to cope and manage with these situations every month. So I welcome you to find that on our event calendar online. We have a lot of people willing and waiting to help in your area. And if not in your area, check the map of chapters, local partners, and resource people for that support directory. A lot of people are more than willing to communicate with you over email and just check in and see how you're doing. I mentioned our Raising Our Celiac Kids part of our website. Also, the other demographic are seniors and our aging population. We're all aging. They definitely face unique challenges, sometimes moving into transitional care settings. So we have an entire page on that. And then lastly, our Feeding Gluten-Free program, which we focus on gluten-free food assistance. I did mention NCA membership. We are a membership organization, and it helps our nonprofit organization to continue to educate and advocate for the gluten-free community. So definitely consider membership. We greatly appreciate it.